The courtyard was built for pride, stone and steel and history, all arranged to make young men believe they were already legends. Boots marked lines across the concrete. Flags shook out their colors like a lesson. In that place where tradition liked to speak louder than truth, a circle formed around one person who did not flinch. A training weapon touched a temple. Laughter chased itself against the walls. A cluster of uniforms jostled for the front row, while arrogance pretended to be courage. The smallest breeze died in the space between the barrel and the stillness of the woman at the center. She did not blink. She did not swallow. She did not give them the mercy of a reaction. The yard, made for ceremony, learned briefly what tension really was. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook composure for surrender. They mistook the absence of fear for the absence of power. It was a common mistake in places like this, where lineage sometimes dressed itself up as leadership and inheritance often paraded as merit. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the stillness in front of them was the kind only forged by fire. Not the ceremonial kind, but the kind that strips a life down to bone and asks if the soul would like to continue. She had come to the academy without markings. No insignia at the shoulder, no sheen of rank at the chest, no introduction delivered by a microphone and an ovation. She had arrived as a shadow in daylight, assigned to observe how potential looked when it thought no authority was watching. Her file had never walked these hallways. It lived in vaults. Her history did not need a stage to be real. Hostile zones had already measured her worth. Classified corridors had written it down. The ocean had already taught her how to breathe through pain. The rows around her were merely catching up. That morning, gray with the weight of incoming rain, she watched them stumble through formation and bluff through tactics. Their posture leaned on a family name. Their smirks leaned on a promise that rules were for other people. Their confidence never once leaned on competence. She took notes with the caution of a surgeon, and when a trainee placed a rubber barrel against her skin, she added a final quiet line. This is not bad behavior. This is danger rehearsing itself. The courtyard absorbed the moment. Far above, a gull traced a single white cut through the air and vanished beyond the roofline. The world did not stop for insults. The world rarely does. But there are seconds that shape entire institutions, and this was one of them. The weapon was plastic. The contempt was not. Around them, laughter swelled and collapsed, a tide made of cruelty. She kept her gaze on the horizon and let the noise prove itself. What she carried into that yard began years earlier, in rooms where she had been the only one of her kind, and no one had apologized for it. Barriers had not asked whether she was ready. They simply stood there until she made them move. She learned early that excellence terrifies entitlement, because excellence cannot be inherited or faked. She learned that some doors are not opened. They are removed from their hinges. She learned that leadership was not volume, nor was it lineage. Leadership was the quiet ability to hold a line when everyone else was practicing excuses. Her record, inked in places without sunshine, would never be read aloud here. It would not list the missions that never made it to the evening news or the evacuations that only happened because she refused to stop moving. It would not describe the hours carrying bleeding weight across impossible ground or the decisions made in the space between a heartbeat and a tragedy. It would not detail the chemical haze that took lives and spared hers, leaving survivors' guilt like an anchor she learned to drag constructively. It would not mention medals because she never wore them to prove anything. The proof was already living in the people who had gotten to live. The academy had invited her to observe. Reality had asked more. She was not there to punish. She was there to measure. But measurement can become justice when evidence decides it has waited long enough. She had not brought a podium. She had brought a recording device that did not blink. Protocol has its own patience. She would trust it. She memorized faces. The one with the weapon, the one who laughed first, the one who laughed last, the one who pretended neutrality while enjoying the spectacle, the one who needed only a leader to become better but had found only loud boys playing soldier. She committed every posture to memory, not for revenge, for accuracy. Somewhere beyond the archway, an experienced officer paused and watched. Years of war had taught him to recognize true authority in the tilt of a head and the distribution of weight in a stance. He did not interrupt. He wanted to see what the courtyard would reveal when it thought it was alone with its bad habits. What came next did not look like drama. It looked like a checklist. First, the recording, clean, uninterrupted, time-stamped. Then the cross-reference, social channels where bravado had confused itself with truth and prejudice, had assumed it would be safe in private group chats. Screenshots lined up like guilty confetti. Memes wearing a uniform of humor, but marching under a flag of contempt. Comments that tried to hide behind tradition. Photos that mistook cruelty for camaraderie. It was all there, curated by the perpetrators. The investigation did not need to invent anything. It needed only to collect what arrogance had spilled. The watch on her wrist, a standard piece of gear, held voices that had just written their own consequence. The tablet at her desk, later that afternoon, held the remainder. A quiet archive of posts and captions and endorsements clicked without thought. The Academy, an institution built on the claim that excellence is its native language, was about to hear what some of its future leaders sounded like when they believed excellence required no translation. She moved through hallways with the calm intention of someone who has learned to bring storms indoors and harness them. The office that received her material knew how to read the signs. Evidence that did not raise its voice. Patterns that could not be shrugged away. Authority that requested nothing and demanded everything. The process activated itself exactly as designed. Review of recordings, confirmation of identities, chain of custody documentation, presentation to leadership. No shortcuts, no grandstanding. Precision feels like ice when you are used to heat, and that afternoon the temperature dropped for everyone who deserved it. Phones in powerful pockets began to buzz. There are parents who understand that rank without character is a hollow threat to the institution that bestowed it. There are others who believe rules are suggestions and reputations are shields. The calls that mattered went unanswered on purpose. The machine of accountability had already begun to turn its gears, and nostalgia for influence could not jam them. In the late hours, a message went out. Assembly. Not the celebratory kind with marching bands and applause. The kind where oxygen thins because truth has entered the room. They arrived in tidy rows, shoulders squared by habit rather than humility. Some arrived confused. Some arrived curious. 4 arrived with the sudden knowledge that a morning's performance can become an afternoon's reckoning. On the stage, a senior officer took his place with an expression that spoke the language of consequence more fluently than any speech could. Beside him, the observer from the courtyard wore her uniform at last. The cloth did not confer power, it revealed it. The story that followed was not told with anecdotes. It was told with evidence. Not with quotations, but with timestamps. Not with outrage, but with policy. The courtyard incident played on the screen as if the yard itself had sprouted eyes. The laughter sounded smaller without the safety of allies. The weapon looked more pathetic in digital replay than it had felt malignant in the moment. Then the feed shifted to the mosaic of social proof. Private jokes curated for a public end. Patterns that made deniability collapse on contact. A map of bias pretending to be banter. 4 names were read, not for humiliation, but for record. 4 futures pivoted. The decision did not require drama. It required compliance with the very standards that make uniforms mean anything at all. Expulsion is not a spectacle when it is justified. It is maintenance. When the auditorium exhaled, it did so differently than it had inhaled. The story they had told themselves about elite institutions being unassailable was slightly less comfortable. The story they began to tell about excellence being accountable was slightly more true. The 4 who left the hall learned something that day that they would not forget. Entitlement confuses consequence with cruelty, but consequence is simply the bill arriving for behavior long deferred. The academy did not return to normal. It rose to standard. The transformation was not a memo. It was a series of choices repeated until they became culture. Behavioral assessments grew teeth and wisdom. Selection began to recognize that fit had often been a code word for sameness. Scholarships arrived for the talented, whose only deficit had been proximity to privilege. Mentoring programs connected those who knew how to build resilience with those who needed to learn how. Instructors who had once shrugged at locker room poison began to see the rot it spreads in the field. Commanders learned to ask not just who can shoot and plan, But who can be trusted to hold a human life without prejudice? Performance metrics rose not because standards fell, but because excellence finally matched its own definition. The person who had walked into the yard as a silent measure did not go searching for a throne. A new role found her, architect of inclusion and operational excellence, a function many had once dismissed as soft until they watched cohesion harden into force-multiplying discipline. She did not make speeches about fairness. She built systems that punished its absence and rewarded its presence. She did not ask the elite to feel guilty. She demanded the elite be worthy. Elsewhere, a father with stars on his shoulder and a weight in his chest understood the paradox of love and duty. He had raised a son inside a fortress of advantage and discovered that it had become a prison for character. In a private office, the air tasted like regret. In a public ledger, a donation appeared that did not absolve, but enabled. Training improved because humility had paid for it. The story did not end in one auditorium. It traveled. Other academies requested the blueprint. A senator with an eye for the difference between optics and outcomes saw a doctrine that could be scaled and offered the platform to do it. National protocols began to bear the fingerprints of someone who knew from experience that bias is not a public relations problem. It is a tactical liability. Units far from that original courtyard began to feel the pressure that protects lives, the pressure to be better than the worst parts of one's inheritance. Time did what it always does. It revealed who meant their promises and who merely survived the moment. Some of the four found ways to build something honest from the rubble. The world is not kind, but it does offer a narrow road back to integrity for those who do the walking. Apologies can be theater. Repentance is work. One learned the difference the hard way, paying bills that no connection could sign. The letter that arrived months later did not alter consequences, but it proved a miracle still possible in human beings, the ability to become different than the person who committed the harm. For the Academy, success measured itself not only in scores, in deployments, but in who felt welcome to serve and who left because the room refused to change. The new standard was not comfort. The new standard was readiness. Diversity stopped being a slogan and became a tested strategic asset. More perspectives in planning, more languages in negotiations, more lived experiences in impossible decisions, more empathy where brutality once felt efficient. When a unit expects everyone to belong, it stops wasting energy proving who deserves to be there. It gets to work. And the observer, the woman whose stillness had once made a circle of boys uncomfortable, continued to do what real leaders do: share credit, absorb blame, and refuse to pretend that progress is linear. She still woke before dawn. She still trained like pain was a teacher, not a punishment. She still sent notes to families no one saw and advocated for recruits no one famous would ever meet. She still paced the edge of parade grounds and watched for the small signs: a hand extended, a cruel joke rejected, a posture corrected for the right reason. There were days when ghosts returned. Loss is not a chapter, it is a watermark. The face of a parent lost to negligence inside a system that called itself efficient would sometimes edge into view. On those nights, the house was quiet and the uniform hung heavier on the chair. But grief, held correctly, becomes a compass. It points to work, not rage. It points to structure, not chaos. It points to a future that refuses to accept a past as destiny. When the first anniversary of the assembly arrived, the Academy staged no spectacle, only sincerity. The field filled with cadets who looked like the nation they had pledged to defend. The anthem sounded less like a habit and more like a promise trying to become true. In the front row, the ones who had almost learned the wrong lesson stood straighter because someone had refused to let them. On the dais, the leader who had changed the institution accepted no spotlight. She knew what triumph looks like in places built on sacrifice. Quiet, durable, a new normal. Beyond the campus, a wider culture learned in ripples. Companies began to understand that prestige without principle is a liability. Families began to see that love without boundaries incubates failure. Recruiters sharpened their eyes for entitlement disguised as confidence, and for humility disguised as quiet competence. Commanders in distant postings wrote back with reports that teams built on respect are faster, smarter, calmer under fire, and less likely to fracture when chaos arrives with teeth. The courtyard on an ordinary afternoon months later watched a new class run drills. The wind moved flags the way time moves eras. A trainee faltered and hands lifted him up without calculation. Another trainee hesitated, and a voice steadied them without condescension. A joke wandered near a line and did not cross it. A standard was enforced without theatrics. Excellence finally was wearing its real face. If a lesson must be written atop the stone that rings that yard, let it be written plainly. Never confuse comfort with character. Never confuse tradition with truth. Never confuse loudness with leadership. The threats that endanger a unit do not always look like enemies. Sometimes they look like us on our laziest day. The true cost of arrogance is paid by people who never committed it. The true work of justice is done by people willing to be hated by a moment in order to be loved by history. As for revenge, the world's favorite myth about how to heal, this story did not need it. Revenge destroys and calls the wreckage victory. Justice builds. Justice documents. Justice teaches. Justice changes who gets to speak and who must be silent. Justice turns a weapon pressed to a temple into a policy pressed into a future. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it simply stands in a circle of noise and refuses to blink. The courtyard was built for pride. It now also holds humility. The academy was built for excellence. It now also trains decency. The nation asks much of its defenders. It has begun to ask the right things. Remember the image with which this began: a barrel at the temple of someone who had already survived everything that makes lesser people cruel. Remember the laughter that seemed to surround her like a cage. Remember how silence became a blade sharper than any insult. Remember how evidence did not blink. Remember how consequence arrived not as a spectacle but as a standard. Remember how an institution stood taller after it was forced to bow to truth. If a moral must close the frame, let it carry weight, not perfume. The most dangerous people in any room are not the loudest. They are the ones who believe they will never be held to account. The strongest person in any room is not the one with the weapon. It is the one with the proof. The finest victory is not the fall of an enemy. It is the rise of a standard that makes the enemy's return impossible. And the best revenge in the end is not to answer cruelty in its language, but to build a world in which it no longer speaks.